Hello, Irvin Studin here, President of the Institute for 21st Century Questions, Editor-in-Chief, Publisher of Global Brief Magazine. We're in the closing stages of our very long but very comprehensive big international conference on the state and future of the world post-pandemic. And for everyone who has been with us, the hundreds across the 2 days, sincere thanks, and reaching out also to our team around the world. Thanks for the terrific work. We had a last-minute confirmation for which we're really honored. I'm delighted, from Alexander Downer, and we got it at the 11th hour. So we changed the program and put Bilahari and Alexander back to back, so that we really could cover much of the world. And by the end of this conference, we will have really covered every region and micro-region. So Alexander, sincere thanks for joining us. Alexander Downer needs little introduction, but I will go quickly and say that he was Minister of Foreign Affairs Extraordinaire in Australia, former Liberal Party leader, also High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, and most importantly, his hometown is Adelaide, Australia, which is my favorite part of Australia, although not the favorite of all Australians, as I'm told. Alexander, thanks for joining us. And so we'll talk. Bilahari Kausikan, who precedes you, gives his regards and was very diplomatic about keeping sang-froid vis-a-vis Oceania. So I think I'll give you the lead to say what's happened in Australia over the last year in the context of the pandemic. Where are you now? And is there a post-pandemic pivot on the horizon for your home country?
So Australia, I suppose, by the standards of the world, particularly by the standards of what you might broadly describe as the Western world, has how could I put it, handled the pandemic pretty well, in that there have been a total of 900 people who have died with coronavirus. Whether that was the actual cause of their death is hard to know, but it's just 900, which, you know, compared to the United Kingdom, from where I'm speaking to you, where more than 50,000 have died with coronavirus. It's a good record. And the way Australia has done that, quite apart from quite good tracing mechanisms that they have put in place state by state in Australia, is that they basically closed down international access to Australia. And coronavirus was coming from abroad, so stopping people coming to Australia has stopped it spreading through Australia, and it has been pretty effective. I mean, it's cut Australia off. Australia's lost some of its GDP, of course, it's shrunk, but nothing like it hasn't been anything like as badly affected as most other countries.
Australia has always had a bit of a quarantine culture and a culture of guarding against both viruses and other maladies coming from the outside. One would know. I lived and worked in Australia, in fact, in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet when you were in government. I remember vividly that there would be very harsh measures upon entry, spraying of airplanes. So is that culture that held you in good stead? And was it a little bit also of the Asian culture of pandemic management, which has held Southeast Asia and East Asia in good stead?
I don't think so much the Asian culture. I think what you said is a very smart observation. I think Australia has always had very tough quarantine laws, and the reason for that is, large as Australia is, it is an island. And so it's been able to keep out various pests, particularly that might damage agriculture. And pandemics and viruses of one kind or another. So it has always had a pretty rigorous approach to quarantine, and has something called the Australian Quarantine Inspection Service, known as AQUIS, which is an incredibly efficient organisation. So when this came along, all of these factors came into play. I mean, in February, might have been the end of January actually, Australia suspended all flights from China into Australia. Might have been the end of January, beginning of February. So very early on, Australia took action to try to stop the pandemic coming into Australia. Didn't, of course, succeed completely, but the spread in it has been spread of it with a good track and trace system. As I mentioned earlier, it's been very limited. But then Australia is a little bit cut off, at least in terms, not in terms of trade, but in terms of people to people movements. And importantly for Australia, it's going to be difficult to resume the foreign student scheme, where Australia has had, I think I'm right in saying, the third largest number of foreign students in its universities of any country in the world. And it is also the third largest foreign exchange earner for Australia, students. So that particular, if I could call it trade, has suffered a terrible blow, and that will be hard to resume again.
Particularly from China and Asia, the student population, correct?
Yeah, I mean, substantially from China, by the way. I mean, in Sydney University, I think I've got these figures roughly right, between 30 and 40% of students are foreign students, and 70% of those foreign students are Chinese. So China is hugely important in terms of students in Australia.
Same dynamic in Alexander, in New Zealand, in terms of their success in fending off the pandemic?
Yes, New Zealand has been even more brutal than Australia, though, in terms of its domestic lockdown. So Australia hasn't taken such harsh domestic measures as New Zealand. As a result, I think the Australian GDP so far has shrunk by about 5%, and I think you'll find in New Zealand their GDP is shrunk by more than double that. So they've taken a much heavier economic blow because their domestic measures have been much more severe than in Australia. But they have a very similar system in terms of stopping people coming from abroad into New Zealand, except that there's now a corridor between Australia and New Zealand. So you can go on a holiday to New Zealand and the other way around, but that's about it.
Here I come. But one key governance difference is, first of all, Australia is very big and New Zealand quite small. And secondly, that Australia, of course, is a federation. So how has the federal dynamic played in the context of pandemic management and the different scenarios across the states?
I guess it's analogous with the United States. I mean, constitutionally, the state governments have responsibility for health, for the health system. So it's the state governments that make the decisions on the extent to which there'll be a lockdown or there won't be a lockdown, or, will restaurants and shops be open or won't they be open, and the times that they open, and all of those issues that everybody watching this seminar this conference will be familiar with, because in every country we have these issues. They are all determined in Australia essentially by the states. The federal government provides the financial support, particularly for people who are in dire danger of losing their jobs. I mean, that's particularly in hospitality, in tourism, in retail and so on, where jobs have been very vulnerable, and actually many have lost their jobs. But the federal government has put in place a subsidy scheme, which is called JobKeeper, in order to try to help stave off mass unemployment. I guess they have succeeded in doing that. But all of that is funded by the federal government. So it's one of those situations where it sounds nice to have regional governments, but the truth is they're substantially dependent on the federal government providing the funding. And so sometimes there have been tensions between the states and the federal government, but mainly they have got on fairly well. They've set up something called a national cabinet, where the premiers of each state and the prime minister meet together periodically and try to resolve any differences that they might have.
Is this a creature of the Council of Australian Governments, or an addendum of that?
A replacement of it, really, because there's a bit of a view that the Council of Australian Governments, which, for the other viewers of this conference, brought together the states and the federal government periodically to discuss issues of mutual concern, and of course always funding. So this national cabinet is really a replacement for the old Council of Australian Government process, known as COAG.
Oh, yeah. Can I ask about unemployment in Australia now? What is it officially? What is it effectively to your knowledge? And how many businesses have gone out of existence?
Well, I couldn't give you the number of businesses that have gone, as you put it, out of existence. I think it'd be hard to assess that. Many have had to close, but hopefully temporarily, and the government has provided substantial financial support for businesses to try to avoid them having to close permanently. So the unemployment rate has gone up somewhat to between 7 and 8%. And the government is really working hard to try to get it back down to below 6%, and are spending, as is in every country, a huge amount of money in order to stave off substantial increases in unemployment and to help people through the pandemic. And that's been reasonably successful. The advantage Australia had was going into this pandemic, there had been a fair degree of fiscal discipline there. And so government debt to GDP was only running at a bit over 20%. So now, whoops, it's gone up a bit. It's now gone up to over 30%. Well, it will do. But nevertheless, Australia has a AAA rating. The Australian government has a AAA rating, and will be one of very, very few countries left on earth that will be able to retain its AAA rating. I mean, that's partly because it inherited a reasonably good fiscal position, and it has improved that fiscal position over the last few years quite substantially. So, you know, when crisis came, they had the capacity to fund the emergency support that was desperately needed. So Australia, I mean, look, this is all relative. Australia has certainly taken a fair hit through the pandemic. But it's the first time the economy has gone into recession in something like 26 years. So it was well placed to take the blow, and it's doing okay through this, and it will come out of it reasonably strongly during the course of next year.
Got it. Can you quickly speak to the state of schooling in Australia? And one of the tragedies that's still underreported and I think misunderstood in official Canada is very similarly advanced country to Australia, federal, but even bigger in territory and demography. We, on my calculation, have at least 100,000 kids, elementary and high school alike, who are out of effective schooling, neither in physical schools nor virtual schools. Now, this is a tragedy in the making, still perhaps remediable, but does Australia have the same problem, or is everyone in school?
At the moment, everyone is back in school. We had a period when they weren't, but in the case of Australia, students have with an exceptional period earlier in the year, students have pretty much continued to go to school. So, I mean, I'm speaking to you at the moment from the UK, where there have been huge problems in terms of the students being able to do exams. And this hasn't been anything like the same problem in Australia. So I think, to be fair, the state governments have responsibility for this issue more than the federal government. Yeah. But they've been very conscious of two things. One is that young people are not likely to be much affected by COVID, although, of course, they could spread it to other members of their family, but they tend not to be substantial spreaders either. So, and secondly, the social consequences of keeping children out of schools can be huge in all sorts of ways, not only for the children themselves and in terms of their lost education, but also for the parents and the carers. I mean, I know this from my own experience. My daughter and son-in-law have two children, and those two children were staying with us in South Australia during a lockdown in Victoria when the schools were shut, and that was for quite a few weeks. And so my grandchildren were working out of our house every day, but you know, it's heavy going just doing schooling online. It's never going to be a substitute for the real thing.
Agreed. Can we talk about the South Pacific, some of the region that's not well known outside of Australia, not even well known in most of Asia, but is intimate to both Australia and New Zealand. What is your, and indeed, I should tell our listeners around the world and online that Alexander wrote in the very first issue of Global Brief back in 2009 on the peace deal. I think it was in Bougainville, and I wonder whether you could speak again to some. I wonder whether you could speak to the situation in some of the South Pacific.
So the South Pacific, Pacific Island countries, as we might say, they have not been too badly affected by the pandemic. That's probably a function of their remoteness, but they certainly haven't been too badly affected by it. So life goes on there. I think the real issue in the South Pacific has been the emergence of what you might call great power competition, the increasing presence of China in the region, which, you know, in and of itself isn't necessarily a great problem. But China and Taiwan compete for recognition in the region, and that leads to a slightly unhappy situation. It doesn't help with the governance of countries in that part of the world. And also, I mean, obviously, from the point of view of Australia or Australia and New Zealand, we don't really want to see great power politics and great power rivalry spreading through the South Pacific. So we're very much guarded against that happening. And there's obviously some downside risk there.
Thank you for that, and that's a great segue to the second part of our global thematic for the conference, post-pandemic, and post-U.S. election. So, how is Canberra interpreting the Biden victory, and how is it preparing itself for a Biden administration?
Well, the people, as you can see from the announcements that have been made already, going into the Biden administration are known quantities to the Australian government. I mean, Jake Sullivan and I are both on the board of the International Crisis Group, so we've only been meeting virtually recently, but when we have been meeting over the years, we meet up with each other. So the Australian government obviously had extensive dealings with the Obama administration, and so far the appointments have been people who have served pretty much in the Obama administration. So I think in that sense it'll be a fairly straightforward transition for the Australian government. Obviously in Canberra they're very focused on whether this is going to constitute any real. I mean, a change of tone is obvious, and everybody participating in this conference will understand that point. But there'll be a change in tone. But in the Indo-Pacific region, I don't think there will be a substantial change of policy at all. I think a Biden administration will behave very much in the same way, but with different language to the Trump administration. So the single most important issue in the world, geopolitical issue in the world today is not COVID or anything else. It's the rise of China and how that is going to be managed by China and how the rest of the world is going to respond to that. So in terms of dealing with China, I think the Biden administration will end up by having a rather similar approach to the Trump administration. I mean, there will be. I mean, you know, people are very partisan about American politics for their own reasons. I mean, it's a free. I like to use the expression my parents always used to use. It's a free world. I think that was wishful thinking on their part. But I always say it. It's a free world. You can think what you like, and you can have whatever political prejudices you want. But I think the reality is, if you sweep away the political prejudices, the differences in terms of foreign policy outside of the climate change issue will be less significant than many people imagine between a Trump administration and a Biden administration.
How, Alexander, and you're great at giving us these segues. How is Canberra preparing for China post-pandemic? and perhaps with the return of all the Chinese students, maybe if Australia gets its way, and also China in the context of a Biden administration? What are the calculations in Canberra?
Well, Canberra is very focused on China because China has effectively declared a trade war on Australia. So they've been unbelievably aggressive towards Australia in a manner which, I mean, as time goes on, is becoming preposterous. And I think people in Australia find it unbelievable that a country which is the second biggest economy in the world and as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, the most populous country in the world, and therefore there's an expectation that it will provide some sort of a leadership role or a leading, if not leadership role in the world, behaves in such a reckless and irresponsible way towards other countries in the region. I mean, you know, China needs to learn that it has to deal in a mature, calm, and rational way with countries with which it might have differences, like Australia. And instead of trying to bully Australia with a lot of aggressive boycotts of Australian trade and the like, and refusing to take calls from the Prime Minister and other ministers in Australia, China should get into the mainstream of international diplomacy, not be an outlier. Sit down and talk with the Australian government and try to resolve the differences that it might have or understand the differences that it has. But instead, they've just declared trade war on Australia. And I mean, I think this is a really interesting issue because, I mean, you've heard from Singapore. Other countries will be very polite in what they say about this. But the truth is that I think there is a growing worry about Chinese diplomacy, not just, of course, in the Indo-Pacific, but beyond. There is a growing concern. And I'm not sure this is the right place for China to be in, because the trouble for China is that particularly the liberal democracies in the Indo-Pacific, but also beyond in Europe and in America and with America itself, they're increasingly coalescing with each other, coordinating policies with each other on dealing with China. And I wouldn't have thought this is what China wants. What China wants is to be in a collaborative and cooperative relationship with the rest of the world, particularly with the Indo-Pacific region, and not have other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. I mean, you just heard about India. But India and Japan, Australia, America are all getting together in the Quad. The other countries in the region increasingly sidling up to Japan, Australia, and India and the US, because they're worried about this sort of surge of aggression that has come out of China under Xi Jinping. It's quite a worry.
What are the key differences between Canberra and Beijing? If you could, in the top 3 or 4.
Well, I mean, what as far as Canberra is concerned, some of them are concerns that everybody has. The allegations about the treatment of the Uyghur people, the steps that China has taken really to undermine the joint declaration on Hong Kong, through the so-called security law, which now applies to Hong Kong, and undermining the one country, two systems process that was in place before. But I mean, Australia's position on that is similar to Canada's or the US or the European Union's, the UK. The positions are all pretty much the same on that. So there's nothing unique about that. They've been very angry with Australia over a couple of specific things. One was, which is an extraordinary thing, the Australian government, without even mentioning China, said given the huge impact of this pandemic on the global community, both in terms of health outcomes and in terms of the economy, there should be some kind of international investigation into how it all happened. And China turned really nasty on Australia just for suggesting that. I mean, China. It sounds like they were saying that they're guilty. But I mean, nobody plenty of people in Australia said it came from China. But the Australian government, in saying there should be a international inquiry, didn't focus on China. And there have been various other issues like that. I think what's actually happened is that China has decided to make an example of Australia, because Australia exports to China are a huge percentage of Australia's total exports. Over 30% of Australia's exports go to China alone. So it's important, and Australia has a big trade surplus with China, so it's important to Australia's economy. But Australia isn't a behemoth. Australia is not such a big country that it can do a lot of damage, at least on its own, to China. So it seems that in Beijing, they've decided to make an example of Australia in the hope that other countries will see what the consequences are for disobeying Beijing. But I think that one thing Australia does have over China is it has more soft power than China. And Australia has a huge number of friends in this world. And so I spent a bit of time talking about this because I think this is a real preoccupation in Canberra, and perhaps over in Toronto, people haven't focused on it so much, but it's a huge preoccupation in Australia. We want a collaborative relationship with China. We don't want a policy of containment or anything like that. But we do want to be able to talk about the differences we have with each other, and we want to work through those differences and understand each other's positions. But, you know, like a kid in a playground, China's leaders are just refusing to speak to the Australians.
Alexander, I would never underestimate the degree to which it's an issue here. We have a very similar dynamic, very tense relationships with China. So that came up when before this conference, we had a major 2-day conference on the state and future of Canada post-pandemic. So the China issue is alive and well. And as Bilahari said, observing as an outsider, Canada's geography suggests that we're more of a Pacific country than we realize. So the China question is looms large. The future is uncertain. So
well,
thank you for evoking that. Yes. The last question, Alexander, if I may, is when in my time in Australia, I discovered that when, at least in the early days, when Australia would fancy itself in Asia, if you go back to the days of Donald Horne even, really you were thinking first and foremost about Indonesia, not China. Indonesia is very close. And on my calculation, actually, Beijing is closer to parts of Canada than it is to Brisbane and Canberra geographically. So, but Indonesia is very close to Australia. So how is Australia looking at Indonesia post-pandemic? Bilahari mentioned quite rightly that Indonesia is struggling conspicuously in Southeast Asia coming out of the pandemic. How does Australia see things in Jakarta?
Well, just go back to your point about geography. I mean, Sydney is a long way down Australia, and Australia is a huge continent. So Darwin is closer to Hong Kong, or Shenzhen, if you want to take China. People's Republic of China is closer to Shenzhen than it is to Auckland. So it depends where you measure these things. So Sydney is a very long way from Indonesia, but the northwest of Australia is very close. So how do we see Indonesia? I mean, Indonesia plods along. We have an excellent relationship with Indonesia. You know, it's had its ups and downs, and when I became the foreign minister, there was a lot of controversy about Indonesia at two levels. One, this President Suharto was in power. Indonesia was a dictatorship. The Australian government understood the importance of working with Indonesia, but it was controversial in Australia making deals with dictators. And the second thing is it's a small issue for most people, but not in Australia and not in Indonesia. And there was the question of East Timor, which the then foreign minister of Indonesia, Ali Alatas, described as a pebble in the shoe of Indonesia, which it is a good way of putting it. It was an eternal problem for them. Anyway, that was all sorted out in sort of 1999, 2000, 2001, through that period. And that's all history now. And, you know, fast forward, Australia negotiated a comprehensive security agreement with Indonesia in 2000, which we concluded in 2006 when I was the foreign minister, and we signed the Treaty of Lombok. I mean, there are sometimes problems, but essentially we have a very strong relationship with them. Now, I would just make this point, since I know this is your last question, and it is about a very important country. Let's remember that Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world and the third largest democracy in the world. And, you know, I talked about President Suharto, but these days Indonesia is a very vibrant, open, free democracy. It's a wonderful country, and it's a huge achievement, the transition from dictatorship to democracy. I mean, it's almost unprecedented in this world, the way they made that change. Indonesia is also the country with the largest Muslim population in the world. So, you know, when you think about Muslim issues, Islam and so on, you think about the Middle East a lot, or we think about Muslim minorities in our own countries. But stop and think about Indonesia, because that's where the largest number of Muslims live in the world. And this is a country of, well, there are definitely exceptions to this, as I know from the Bali bombings, but this is a country of moderate Islam. And it can be a real help as a country in building bridges between Islam and other, not just religions, but other civilizations. So I think it's a country that deserves much more focus, much more attention in the international community than it gets. And but that's particularly true of Western countries. When you go to Europe or the UK, or for that matter, the US, Canada, they don't give much thought to Indonesia, but this is a hugely important country. And sure, it's next to Australia, so we're very focused on it. But there's much more to Indonesia than being next to Australia.
Right on. Alexander, our sincere thanks at the Institute and Global Brief applause. And we bid you a wonderful night in London.
Thank you. Thanks, Evan.